Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into something today that I think is going to be super relevant for anyone who works with
Oh,
students.
yeah.
It's all about the difference between prompts and cues in the classroom.
Interesting.
Our source material for today is an article called Prompts versus Cues in Classroom Management Supporting Independence, Not Dependence.
Okay.
It's by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks, and it's from the Outside publication.
Sounds like a good one.
It is.
Oh,
And I think, it's really fascinating because it looks at how even seemingly small changes in the way that we guide students can have a really big impact on their learning and independence.
I could see that.
Yeah. And the article actually opens with a story about a student named Miguel who becomes so reliant on his teacher's prompts
Okay.
that he can't even start his work without being told exactly what to do step by step.
Oh, wow.
So it really got me thinking, like, how often are we as educators unintentionally creating this kind of prompt dependency in our classrooms?
That's a really good question. I'm sure it happens a lot.
I think so too. And that's why I think it's so important for us to understand the nuances between these two things.
Yeah, totally. So, just to kind of lay the groundwork, what exactly are prompts and cues?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
So Dr. Horrocks defines prompts as being direct instructions or actions that are really aimed at controlling a student's behavior.
Okay.
So it'd be like telling Miguel start writing, or even
Yeah.
like physically guiding his hand to pick up a pencil.
Okay. So, very direct and kind of taking control, essentially.
Exactly.
Whereas cues would be,
Cues are much more subtle. They're more like those gentle nudges or reminders
gotcha.
that encourage that self-regulation.
So, it's less about telling them what to do and more about kind of guiding them towards figuring it out on their own.
Exactly. So instead of giving a student turn-by-turn directions, you're giving them the map and compass to find their way.
I like that analogy.
But what I found really interesting is that the article actually goes a little bit deeper and suggests that this overuse of prompts, it's kind of rooted in this behaviorist model of education,
Ah, interesting.
which puts so much emphasis on immediate compliance over that long-term autonomy.
Right. So it's like prioritizing that immediate do what I say over helping them develop the skills to manage themselves.
Exactly. And while I think behaviorism has its place,
Of course.
relying too heavily on those prompts, it can actually hinder a student's ability to really develop self-reliance and initiative.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially, I imagine, for neurodivergent students who might be particularly sensitive to being overly prompted.
Absolutely, and that's something we'll dive into a bit more later. But yeah, there's actually a lot of research to back this up.
Oh, really?
Yeah, several studies, including some by Alberto and Sharpton, have found that when we're constantly prompting students,
Mm.
it prevents them from actually learning to initiate those actions on their own.
Because they're always waiting for that external signal, right?
Exactly. They're not developing those internal cues or that motivation to self-start.
Right. So, in a way, we're almost training them to become dependent on us.
Yeah. And think about the long-term effects of that.
Hmm.
If students are always reliant on external prompts to guide their behavior,
Yeah.
how are they going to function in those situations where those prompts aren't available?
It's true. They might really struggle, especially in situations where they need to be more independent.
Exactly. So it can impact everything from time management and organization to even social interactions, right?
Yeah, definitely. If they're used to someone always telling them exactly what to do, they might not pick up on those subtle social cues that tell us how to act in different situations.
It's like we're kind of inadvertently teaching them this learned helplessness instead of giving them the power to really take charge of their own learning.
Yeah, that's kind of a scary thought.
It is. But the good news is there's a better way.
Oh, good.
And Dr. Horrocks really argues that cues are that much more effective approach because they encourage, again, that self-regulation and that autonomy.
Okay, so instead of relying on us to constantly tell them what to do, they learn to recognize and respond to those more subtle cues.
Exactly. Whether it's those subtle environmental cues, visual reminders, or even those internal cues that are based on their own understanding of what they're supposed to be doing.
Got it. So it's kind of like setting up the environment and the routine in a way that naturally guides their behavior.
Exactly. So, for instance, instead of saying, okay, it's time to clean up, you might just flip the lights on and off.
Right.
And the students then know, okay, that means it's time to transition to the next activity.
Oh, I love that.
It's that simple.
Yeah. Or like using a visual timer to help them manage their time during independent work.
Yes.
It's like giving them that gentle nudge without completely taking over.
Exactly.
This is making me think about my own classroom. I wonder if I've been relying too much on prompts.
I think it's something we all do. I know I've been thinking about it too.
Yeah. I've always focused on getting my students to comply with my instructions,
Right.
but maybe I haven't really given them enough space or trust to figure things out on their own.
It's a good insight. And it's a common trap that we fall into as educators, right?
For sure. We want things to run smoothly, and it can feel easier to just tell students exactly what to do.
Right. But I think the article really does encourage us to design our classrooms around that student's need for that autonomy.
Yeah, and not just our need as teachers to feel in control.
Exactly. And that's especially crucial for students with IEPs, those individualized education programs.
Right, because they might need specific accommodations and support to really thrive.
And speaking of IEPs, Dr. Hoerricks also points out that cues are particularly beneficial for autistic students
That makes sense.
because they often thrive on routine and predictability.
So those cues can provide that consistent framework without being too intrusive or controlling.
Exactly. And there's research that suggests that autistic students may be even more prone to that prompt dependency if we're not being careful.
Oh, wow.
So, instead of relying on a teacher to say, it's time to work on math, a visual schedule on their desk
Right.
could be that cue.
That allows them to transition independently.
Yes. And it really allows them to build that sense of, I can do this on my own.
That's so important for their self-esteem and confidence.
It really is. And this shift from that external control to that self-management, it's empowering for any student,
Absolutely.
but especially for those who may need that extra support in developing these skills.
So we've talked about how great cues are, but what are some practical tips for actually using them effectively?
Yeah, how do we put this into action?
Right, like are there specific types of cues that work best in different situations?
Totally.
Well, the best type of cue really depends on the situation and also, the individual student's needs.
Okay.
But Dr. Hoerricks talks a lot about visual cues.
Oh, interesting.
Things like, color-coded systems,
Right.
visual schedules, checklists,
Yeah.
especially helpful for those students who really, benefit from that clear, structured visual information.
Yeah, I've seen those used very effectively in classrooms before. Even something as simple as, a timer on the board
Oh, yeah, definitely.
can be a really powerful cue for students to stay on task during independent work.
Absolutely.
And it also, I think, kind of takes the pressure off of us as teachers
Yeah.
to have to constantly be reminding them about time limits.
Totally. Like it's creating that external structure that kind of supports that internal regulation.
Right.
And as they become more familiar with the routines and expectations,
Yeah.
you can start to kind of fade those external cues and encourage them to rely more on those internal cues.
So how do we help students develop those internal cues?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah, is that something we could explicitly teach, or does it just kind of happen organically over time?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks actually talks about a technique called self-regulation strategy development,
Okay.
or SRSD,
Okay.
where teachers actually explicitly teach students strategies for managing their behavior, their emotions, and their learning process.
I'm not familiar with SRSD.
So it's kind of like, giving them the tools and the mental frameworks they need to become their own self-managers.
Oh, okay.
For example, teachers might model their own thought processes out loud,
Right.
helping students understand those strategies behind the actions.
So it's like we're kind of demystifying the whole learning process for them,
Exactly.
making it more transparent, more accessible.
And it goes beyond just, following instructions.
Right.
It's about fostering metacognition.
Metacognition,
The
okay.
ability to think about one's own thinking.
So being aware of their own learning process.
Exactly. And that's like a crucial skill for lifelong success.
Absolutely.
And we can cultivate it through those intentional teaching practices like SRSD.
I love how this all connects back to that idea of empowerment.
Yeah.
It's not about controlling their every move.
It's about giving them the skills and support to direct themselves.
Exactly.
And Dr. Hoerricks even shares some of the specific techniques they use in their classroom to create this, cue-based, student-centered environment.
I'd love to hear about those.
Okay, so they use a lot of color-coded organization and visual cues,
Okay.
not just in the physical classroom, but also within their learning management system.
The LMS. Makes sense. I mean, so many classrooms now are incorporating online learning platforms.
Right. It's about creating that structure in both spaces.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for instance, they have this color-coded system within their LMS where each subject or task type is assigned a specific color.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So students can visually identify, what type of work they're doing without needing those constant verbal reminders.
I can see how that would be so helpful.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially for students who struggle with organization or get overwhelmed easily.
Yeah, for sure.
And they also utilize that assignment function within the LMS that syncs with the calendar feature.
Oh, smart.
Right. So students can see, deadlines, upcoming work, all at a glance.
That's great for promoting that self-management.
Yeah, exactly. And reducing that reliance on the teacher for those reminders.
That's fantastic.
So you're basically replicating those visual cues and routines we see in a physical classroom,
Right.
bringing that consistency and predictability into the online space.
And what I think is so impressive is that they even allow students to customize their notifications within the LMS.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
So whether it's automatic alerts, scheduled check-ins, personalized reminders,
They have that control.
they have control, to set up a system that really works best for them.
That's really putting the student at the center.
It is, and giving them that agency
Yeah.
over how they manage their time and their workflow.
And it highlights a crucial point.
What's that?
The goal isn't to remove structure altogether.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
It's about building that seamless, student-centered system that empowers them to take ownership.
Instead of just waiting for instructions at every step.
Exactly.
This is seriously making me rethink my entire approach.
To both the physical classroom and your online platform.
Both.
It's a process, and it's different for every educator and every student.
Right.
But that key takeaway here is that we can create learning environments that are both structured and supportive of autonomy.
I agree. And I think that's where the real magic happens.
Right, when those two things come together.
Yeah. There's this thought-provoking question that Dr. Hoerricks poses in the article that I wanted to bring up.
Okay, what is it?
They ask, if professional development were designed with this same user-centered philosophy,
Oh, interesting.
what would it look like?
Wow, yeah, that's a really good question.
It is, and it's something for us all to consider, I think.
Because we talk so much about student-centered learning.
Right.
But what about teacher-centered professional development?
Totally.
What if those learning experiences for us as educators
Yeah.
were also designed to empower us with choice and self-direction?
Instead of just, bombarding us with information and directives.
Right, like it's kind of ironic that we often teach one way but then experience professional development in a completely different way.
Right.
It makes you wonder what other areas of life could benefit from this shift toward cue-based systems that foster autonomy and self-regulation.
That's a really good question. We spent this deep dive really exploring this idea of, prompts versus cues.
Yeah.
And I think it's become really clear that shifting our focus from that control to empowerment can make a huge difference for learners
Oh, absolutely.
of all ages, not just students.
Right, this goes way beyond the classroom.
But it's one thing to understand the concept, right?
Yeah.
It's another to actually put it into practice.
Totally. It's all about those practical takeaways.
Exactly. So let's kind of shift gears a bit and talk about what this looks like in real life.
Love it. From theory to action.
Yes. And actually, Dr. Hoerricks gives some really great advice in the article.
Oh, good.
One key strategy that really stuck with me is this idea of, consciously fading out those excessive prompts and replacing them with those more subtle, supportive cues.
That's where the real transformation begins, I think.
I think so, too. So instead of giving those direct instructions, maybe try phrasing requests in a way that encourages the person to really think for themselves
Oh, I like that.
and come up with their own solutions.
So it's less about do this and more about what do you think about this?
Exactly.
How can we approach this?
Yeah. So instead of saying, put your phone away, you might ask, what's our agreement about phones during dinner?
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. And it invites that conversation.
Totally. And it puts the responsibility on them to
Exactly.
think about the why behind the rule.
And I remember the article talking a lot about, visual cues over verbal ones.
Oh, yeah. Visual cues can be so powerful.
I think that's especially relevant for those who are working with, younger children.
Right.
Or those who process information more visually.
Well, think about how we use them in everyday life.
It's true.
Traffic lights, road signs, even the icons on our phone.
Yeah.
They're all guiding our behavior
Right.
without us needing constant verbal instructions.
So true.
So instead of, constantly reminding a child to put their shoes on before going outside,
Right.
you might have a little picture checklist by the door,
Oh, I love that.
or even just place their shoes right in their path as a visual cue.
It's like that gentle reminder without the nagging. You're
Exactly.
not taking over the task for them.
And I think this is so important because, as individuals become more familiar with the routines and expectations,
Right.
you can actually gradually fade those external cues
Okay.
and encourage them to rely more on those internal
It's
ones.
like you're building that scaffolding
Yes,
and then slowly removing it as they gain that confidence and competence.
exactly. But I think it's important to remember
What's that?
everyone is different.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
And Dr. Hoerricks really emphasized that,
They did it.
this idea of personalization.
That's so important.
Just like students have different learning styles,
Right.
Individuals in all walks of life respond differently to different types of cues.
Absolutely. So a one-size-fits-all approach just isn't gonna cut it.
And they use this term in the article that I love, user-centered.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
I think it really captures this beautifully, whether we're talking about classrooms, workplaces, personal development.
It's about really tailoring our approach to the individual's needs and preferences.
This makes me think about all the times I've tried to implement a new system at home
Oh, yeah.
or even at work,
Uh-huh.
and it just falls flat.
And now you're realizing it might be because you weren't considering their perspective.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I was approaching it from my own perspective.
Right. And not thinking about how it would be received by the people I was trying to help.
That's a common pitfall, I think.
It is. But when we shift to that user-centered perspective, we're so much more likely to create systems that are both effective and empowering.
This has been so eye-opening.
Me too.
It's made me realize that this shift from prompts to cues,
Yeah.
it's not just about changing our behaviors.
It's deeper than that.
It's about changing our beliefs
I love that. It's about trusting in their capacity to learn and grow.
and self-direct
Exactly.
and creating environments that really foster that.
Whether it's in our homes, schools, workplaces, communities.
This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive
My pleasure.
into this fascinating world of prompts and cues.
I know. Who knew it could be so interesting, right?
I hope everyone listening has come away with some new insights and a renewed sense of possibility.
Me too.
And just remember, even those small shifts in our approach can have a ripple effect,
It's true.
creating more empowering and supportive environments for everyone.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Thanks again for being here.
Thanks for having me.